I am Richard Big, though everyone in the high-stakes commercial real estate world knows me simply as Dick. I am 70 years old, and I recently inherited a rundown, rotting farm from my late wife while my son received our $12 million penthouse in Los Angeles. My own flesh and blood called me a useless old man and threw me out onto the street. So I decided to drive out and spend the night at that abandoned farm. But when I pushed open the heavy wooden door, I froze completely at what I saw hidden inside. Before I continue this story, please let me know which city or country you are watching from in the comments below. It brings a lot of warmth to this old man's heart to know where my listeners are joining me from. And please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. If you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who severely underestimated your worth, I promise you, what I am about to tell you will change the way you look at the people closest to you forever. Let me take you back to the exact moment my entire reality shattered. It was a gloomy Tuesday morning, exactly 3 weeks after I buried my beautiful wife, Sarah. We had been married for 40 incredible years, 4 decades of shared dreams, building a massive real estate portfolio from scratch, and creating what I genuinely believed was a rock-solid, loving family. I had stepped down as the chairman of my firm a few years prior, willingly giving up my hard-earned career just so I could care for Sarah during her final grueling battle with illness. I loved her more than life itself, and I would have traded all my wealth and success just to have one more healthy day with her by my side. I was sitting in the freezing glass-walled office of our longtime estate attorney, Gregory Pierce. The room felt sterile and lifeless, completely devoid of the warmth that Sarah always brought into any room she entered. Across the heavy mahogany conference table sat my son Cameron and his wife Monica. They were dressed in immaculate, custom-tailored designer clothing, checking their expensive watches, and looking more like they were preparing for an exclusive red carpet event than mourning the recent loss of a mother. I sat there, in my simple black suit, feeling the heavy exhaustion of grief weighing down my bones. I expected this reading of the will to be a simple, mundane formality. Sarah and I had always discussed our estate planning together over morning coffee. I assumed the core assets would remain in my control to manage until my time eventually came, and then it would seamlessly pass down to Cameron. Gregory cleared his throat, adjusting his reading glasses as he looked down at the thick stack of legally binding documents. His voice was completely flat and monotonous, entirely detached from the emotional bomb he was about to detonate in the middle of that room. He started by reading the clause regarding our primary residence, the $12 million luxury penthouse in downtown Los Angeles. I knew that property inside and out. I had paid for it in pure cash 10 years ago, designing every single inch of it alongside Sarah so it could be our perfect forever home with panoramic views of the city skyline. Gregory stated clearly, reading the precise legal jargon without any hesitation, that full ownership and title of the Los Angeles penthouse was to be transferred immediately to Cameron and Monica. I blinked hard, genuinely believing that my 70-year-old ears were playing a cruel trick on me. I waited for Gregory to correct himself to mention my life estate, or at least my continued right to reside in the home I bought. But he did not. He just kept reading, moving right past it, as if my 40 years of marriage and financial contributions meant absolutely nothing. And then he reached the portion of the will regarding my inheritance. According to the document, I, the man who had loved, protected, and provided for Sarah every day of her adult life, was left with nothing but an abandoned, rotting farm out in Ojai. It was a desolate, overgrown piece of property, a full 2 hours away from the city, a barren plot of dirt we had acquired years ago and completely forgotten about. I leaned forward slowly, my hands gripping the armrests of my leather chair so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I looked at Gregory, my voice trembling with a chaotic mixture of deep grief and absolute confusion. I asked him politely to stop reading, asking if there was some sort of clerical mistake, some drafting error that had accidentally swapped the names. Before Gregory could even open his mouth to answer my question, Cameron lunged across the large table and violently snatched the document right out of the attorney's hands. He let out a sharp, arrogant laugh that echoed off the cold glass walls of the office. In that single terrifying second, the mask of the grieving, supportive son completely vanished. He looked at me and his eyes were filled with pure, unadulterated disdain. I will never forget the absolute coldness in his stare, a stare that made my blood run cold. You heard the man, Dad Cameron said, his voice dripping with venomous condescension. The penthouse is ours now. There is no mistake. Mom finally saw things clearly before she died. She knew you were losing your edge, losing your mind. And frankly, a useless old man like you has no business living in a $12 million property. The room started spinning. The boy I had taught to ride a bike, the son I had proudly put through the finest business schools in America. The child I had sacrificed my own sleep to comfort when he was sick, was looking at me like I was a piece of garbage taking up space. I tried to speak, to demand an explanation, but the shock completely suffocated me. Cameron leaned in closer, aggressively tapping the heavy legal paper against the polished wood table. You need to go home, pack your bags, and be out of my property by 5:00 this evening, he demanded, narrowing his eyes. Monica and I are hosting a private dinner for some very important VIP clients tonight. We are closing a massive deal, and we absolutely do not have the time or the patience to deal with a senile old fool wandering around the living room and ruining our image. I was entirely numb. My chest ached with a pain far worse than any physical injury I had ever sustained. I do not even remember the long car ride back to the penthouse. I just remember the deeply humiliating blur of throwing 40 years of my beautiful life into 2 small travel suitcases. I was forced to pack my most basic belongings while my son's hired private security detail stood by the bedroom door, watching my every move as if I were a common thief stealing from a hotel. By 4:30 in the afternoon, I was standing in the grand marble hallway by the front elevators, literally being pushed out of the very home I had bought with my own blood, sweat, and tears. The heavy brass elevator doors chimed, ready to take me down to the lobby and out of their lives forever. Just as I grabbed the handle of my suitcase, feeling completely defeated, Monica stepped out of the shadows of the corridor. She wore a sickening, victorious smirk that made my stomach churn. She reached into the pocket of her expensive designer blazer and shoved a small unmarked prescription bottle roughly into my hand. Sarah's dying wish, Monica whispered, leaning uncomfortably close to my ear so the security guards could not hear. Take 2 a day for your heart, old man. Have a safe drive to nowhere. The heavy brass doors slid shut, sealing me out of the life I had built. I stood there in the polished marble hallway, the cold surface of the unmarked plastic bottle pressing into my palm. Monica's cruel whisper echoed in my ears as I gripped the handle of my suitcase and made my way down to the underground parking garage. The descent felt like a funeral march. I found my beat-up Ford pickup truck parked between 2 gleaming European sports cars. It was a relic from my early days in construction, a truck I kept purely out of nostalgia and a stubborn refusal to forget where I came from. I tossed my bags onto the passenger seat and climbed behind the steering wheel. The leather was worn, smelling faintly of old coffee and sawdust. I sat there in the dim fluorescent lighting, staring at the small white pills inside the clear plastic container. There was no label, no dosage instructions, no pharmacy stamp, just smooth white tablets. My mind was racing, trying to process the absolute whiplash of the last 2 hours. Sarah and I had built an empire together. We had shared every financial decision, every triumph, and every burden. How could she secretly draft a will that left me destitute while handing our crown jewel over to a son who looked at me with such venom it did not make sense? Sarah was a meticulous woman. She was a former forensic accountant who scrutinized every contract and every bank statement we ever signed. Leaving me with a decaying farm in Ojai and a bottle of mystery pills was completely contrary to the woman I had loved for 40 years. I needed answers. I pulled my phone from my pocket and stared at the screen. My thumb hovered over Cameron's name. I took a deep breath, trying to steady the tremor in my hand and pressed dial. The phone rang 3 times before the line clicked open. I expected him to bark at me to ask why I was bothering him when he was busy preparing for his very important clients. Instead, I heard the faint clinking of expensive crystal glasses in the background and the soft murmur of unfamiliar voices. Then Cameron spoke. The sheer hostility from the lawyer's office was completely gone. In its place was an overly warm, sickeningly sweet tone that sent a chill straight down my spine. "Dad," he said, his voice projecting loudly through the speakerphone. "I am so glad you called back. Monica and I were just talking about you. Are you doing all right, Pop? Do you need us to call a car service to help you get out to the country?" I gripped the steering wheel, grinding my teeth. He was putting on a show. He was playing the role of the deeply concerned, loving son for his wealthy guests. "Cameron," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "What is going on? Why did your mother leave the penthouse to you? We built that home together. And what exactly are these pills?" Monica shoved into my hand. Cameron let out a soft, patronizing sigh, perfectly calibrated to sound like a man bearing the heavy burden of an aging parent. "Oh, Dad," he murmured sympathetically. "We talked about this at the lawyer's office. Remember, Mom did this to protect you. She knew you were struggling to keep up with things lately." I frowned completely, thrown off balance by his calm demeanor. Protect me by throwing me out on the street. Protect me by sending me to a rotting farmhouse 2 hours away from my doctors and my community. "Yes, Dad," Cameron replied smoothly, his tone remarkably patient. "Think about it logically for a second. The property taxes and the homeowner association fees on this penthouse run close to $200,000 a year. You are 70 years old and living on a fixed retirement income now. If Mom had left this property in your name, the city and the banks would have drained your savings within a year. You would have gone bankrupt trying to maintain a $12 million asset all by yourself." I sat silently in the driver's seat, listening to the hum of the garage ventilation system. His words hit me like a splash of cold water. From a strictly financial perspective, it made a brutal kind of sense. Sarah had always been ruthlessly pragmatic about taxes and asset protection. Could she have made a cold, calculated decision to preserve my small cash reserves by offloading the massive liability of the penthouse onto Cameron? "Have peace and quiet in Ojai," Cameron continued softly, leaning into the silence. "She wanted you to spend your golden years away from the smog and the noise of the city, resting on a quiet piece of land. And those pills, Dad, please do not be stubborn about them. You know your memory has been slipping lately. You have been forgetting names, misplacing your keys, getting confused during conversations. Mom was terrified about your cognitive decline. She spent a fortune having those high-end Swiss cognitive supplements special ordered for you as before she passed. She made Monica promise to make sure you took them. 2 a day, just like she wanted. Please take them, Dad. For Mom." I closed my eyes. Was I really losing my mind? Had my grief made me paranoid, turning my own son into a villain simply because I was hurt by a practical financial decision I did not have the energy to fight him anymore? I told him I would call him when I arrived in Ojai and ended the call. I sat in the dim light of the truck cabin for a long time. The logic of his argument slowly settled into my tired brain. It was a harsh reality, but perhaps they were right. Perhaps I was just a tired old man who needed to accept his new reality. I popped the cap off the plastic bottle, tapped a single smooth white tablet into my palm, and swallowed it dry with a quick sip of lukewarm water from a water bottle in my cup holder. I started the engine, put the truck in gear, and drove out of the underground garage, leaving my entire life behind me. The late afternoon sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon as I merged onto the Pacific Coast Highway. The rhythmic sound of the ocean waves crashing against the shoreline usually brought me comfort, but today the sound felt distant and muffled. 40 minutes into the drive along the winding coastal road, the world outside my windshield began to warp. My vision blurred violently, turning the bright orange sunset into a smeared, chaotic painting. A sudden, terrifying cold sweat broke out across my forehead, and my hands started shaking so violently that I could barely maintain my grip on the leather steering wheel. I gasped, realizing my heart rate was dropping dangerously low, feeling like my chest was filling with heavy cement. I slammed the brake pedal, the tires screaming, and jerked the truck onto the gravel shoulder before the world faded into darkness. I woke up with a sudden, violent gasp, my lungs burning as if I had been submerged underwater for hours. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles aching from holding the worn leather. The truck cabin was completely dark, save for the faint dashboard lights illuminating the heavy beads of sweat rolling down my forehead. I blinked rapidly, trying to force my eyes to focus through the thick, unnatural fog that had taken over my mind. My heart was pounding against my ribs, an erratic rhythm that felt entirely wrong. I checked the dashboard clock. It was nearly 7 in the evening. I had been unconscious on the highway shoulder for over 3 hours. I rolled down the window, letting the cold ocean breeze hit my face. The crisp air acted like a physical slap, slowly pulling my senses back. I am 70 years old, but I spent 35 years as a commercial real estate developer. My career was built on spotting discrepancies, identifying risks, and reading people trying to hide the truth. I leaned back against the headrest, closing my eyes as the puzzle pieces violently snapped together. Cameron and Monica did not care about my cognitive health. Those white tablets were not high-end Swiss memory supplements ordered by my wife. They were heavy, dangerous sedatives, or something worse. They had deliberately handed me unmarked narcotics right before I merged onto a treacherous, winding coastal highway. If my reflexes had been even a fraction of a second slower, my truck would have plummeted off the cliffs and into the ocean. It would have looked like a tragic accident, a grieving, senile old man who lost control of his vehicle. I reached into the passenger seat, my trembling fingers finding the plastic bottle. A surge of pure anger washed over me, burning away the remaining fog in my mind. I hurled the bottle into the darkness. I listened to it clatter against the rocks and disappear into the crashing waves. I took a deep breath, gripped the gear shift, and pulled my truck back onto the highway. I was no longer a confused, grieving widower. I was a man who had just survived an attempted execution by his own flesh and blood. The rest of the drive inland was a blur of dark, winding roads. I left the ocean behind, navigating the steep routes deep into the Ojai Valley. By the time my GPS indicated I was approaching the property, the sun had dipped below the mountain ridgeline, casting long, eerie shadows. I turned off the paved road and onto a rugged dirt driveway entirely choked with overgrown weeds. The branches of dying oak trees scraped aggressively against my truck as I crept forward. After a mile, the dense tree line broke, revealing the property Sarah had left me. I shifted into park and stared through the dusty windshield. It looked like a setting from a cheap horror movie. The main farmhouse was a decaying structure. The porch roof had caved in, the wooden siding was rotting, and every window was either boarded up or shattered. Tall grass swallowed the front steps, and a rusted tractor sat abandoned in the side yard. It was a desolate wasteland. This was the peace and quiet Cameron had smugly talked about. A property so worthless that no one would ever come looking for me. I stepped out, the crunch of dry gravel echoing in the stillness of the valley. The air here was entirely different from the coast. It was dry still and completely devoid of life. I grabbed a heavy metal flashlight from behind my seat to cut through the encroaching darkness. I walked around the perimeter of the farmhouse, shining the light over the collapsed roof and cracked foundation. Evaluating properties was practically woven into my DNA. I automatically started assessing the structural integrity, foundation, settling, and roof load. The house was beyond repair. It was a complete teardown. There was no logical reason for Sarah, a brilliant forensic accountant, who managed our assets with ruthless precision, to hold on to a dead property like this for a decade. It made zero financial sense. She hated dead assets. She hated paying taxes on useless land. Why would she secretly keep this ruin And why would she specifically single it out to be my sole inheritance? I continued walking past the main house, my boots crunching over dead branches and scattered debris. The property extended far back into a dense cluster of towering trees. As I moved away from the farmhouse, my flashlight beam swept across the ground, and I stopped dead in my tracks. My developer instincts, honed over 3 decades of inspecting construction sites, flared violently to life. The narrative Cameron had spun was falling apart right beneath my feet. The driveway leading up to the main house was covered in years of untouched, overgrown brush. But the path leading past the house, curving toward the back of the property, was different. I crouched down, shining the light directly onto the dirt. The earth here was deeply compacted and heavily rutted. These were not the tracks of a lost hiker or a wandering local. These were fresh, deep, heavy-duty truck tire tracks, the kind made by commercial utility vehicles carrying massive payloads. And there were dozens of them, overlapping each other, creating a clear, recently used road right through the mud. I stood up, my heart beginning to race again, but this time not from the sedatives. I followed the heavy tracks, letting them guide me deeper into the property. The trees parted again, revealing a massive looming structure situated at the very back of the lot. It was a large corrugated metal barn. The exterior was cleverly painted and weathered to look just as abandoned and rusted as the main farmhouse. It blended in perfectly with the desolate environment. But as I walked closer, shining my light along the side of the structure, my breath caught in my throat. Running down the side of an old wooden utility pole hidden in the trees was a thick black electrical cable. I followed the cable with my flashlight as it swooped down and connected directly into the side of the rusted barn. It was a brand new industrial-grade 3-phase power line. In commercial real estate, you only run 3-phase power lines for specific reasons. You run them when you need to support heavy manufacturing equipment, massive industrial refrigeration units, or high-density computer server farms. You do not install industrial power grids into an abandoned, rotting barn in the middle of nowhere. I slowly lowered my flashlight, stepping closer to the massive metal doors of the barn. The air around the structure felt different. There was a faint, almost imperceptible, low-frequency hum vibrating through the ground beneath my boots. Someone was drawing a massive amount of electricity into this supposed ruin. Why is there a brand new industrial-grade 3-phase power line running into an abandoned barn? And why are there fresh, heavy-duty truck tire tracks heading straight for the back of the property? I had to find out what was inside. I turned away from the heavy metal doors of the mysterious barn and slowly made my way back toward the decaying farmhouse. The crisp evening air had grown noticeably colder as night fully descended upon the quiet Ojai Valley. My heavy work boots crunched softly over the dry, overgrown weeds and deeply cracked earth. I needed to get inside the main house immediately. I needed to sit down in a secure place and mentally process the sheer magnitude of the baffling anomalies I had just uncovered out back. I approached the wooden porch and forcefully pushed open the front door of the main house. Its severely rusted hinges shrieked violently into the otherwise quiet night, sounding eerily like an injured animal crying out in the dark. The interior of the house smelled intensely of stale dust, spreading dry rot, and countless years of absolute unforgiving neglect. I stepped inside and swept the bright beam of my heavy metal flashlight across the desolate living room. The faded, floral wallpaper was peeling off the walls in long, yellowed strips, and the uneven floorboards groaned loudly under my shifting weight. There was a single tattered armchair sitting perfectly in the center of the dark room, covered completely by a thin white sheet that had turned a sickly gray color with age. I reached out and pulled the dirty sheet away, sending a thick cloud of dust particles into the stale air, and sank heavily into the worn cushions. My mind was spinning relentlessly. The industrial 3-phase power line, the fresh heavy-duty tire tracks in the mud, the completely uncharacteristic behavior of my highly organized, pragmatic late wife. Absolutely none of it made any logical sense yet. All these hidden clues pointed directly to something massive and highly secretive being hidden right here on this forgotten piece of land. Before I could even begin to piece together a rational theory, the sudden shrill ringing of my cell phone violently shattered the dead silence of the isolated farmhouse. I flinched physically, my tired heart suddenly jumping directly into my throat. The sudden digital noise was absolutely deafening in the empty, echoing room. I quickly pulled the phone from my jacket pocket, fully expecting to see Gregory, the cold estate attorney, calling to arrogantly finalize some leftover legal paperwork from the morning. Instead, the bright glowing screen displayed a name that instantly made my blood run entirely cold. It was Monica, my incredibly cruel daughter-in-law. The exact same woman who just a few short hours ago had shoved a suspicious bottle of heavy sedatives directly into my hand and practically kicked me out onto the street with a vicious, triumphant smirk on her face. Why on earth would she be calling me now, deep into the evening? I stared blankly at the glowing screen as the phone vibrated repeatedly against my palm. Every single survival instinct I had, painstakingly developed over 3 decades in the cutthroat commercial real estate industry, screamed at me not to answer her call. But a deeper, much more strategic voice in my head firmly told me to pick it up immediately. I needed to know exactly what she wanted. I cleared my throat forcefully, forcing my tense facial muscles to relax, and slowly swiped the green button to accept the unexpected call. I brought the digital device up to my ear and let out a soft, tired greeting. I barely recognized the distinct voice that responded on the other end of the line. Dad. Oh, thank goodness you finally answered the phone. Did you make it there safely? Monica asked breathlessly. Her vocal tone was completely unrecognizable to me now. The venomous, icy condescension from the luxury penthouse hallway was entirely gone. In its place was an overly sweet, highly frantic, and almost desperate level of parental concern. Her voice was pitched artificially high, fluttering with a feigned, dramatic anxiety that instantly made my skin crawl with discomfort. It was a calculated performance, a terribly transparent and poorly acted one, but I decided to play along with her twisted game. Yes, Monica, I muttered softly, intentionally making my voice sound incredibly slow, weak, and extremely heavy. I made it. I am currently inside the farmhouse. Oh, I am so incredibly relieved, she continued, speaking entirely too fast for a normal conversation. Listen, Dad. I was just wondering. Have you walked around the outer property yet? Did you happen to go into the old barn out back? Mom always talked fondly about that specific barn. Did she perhaps leave anything interesting in there for you? Did you open the big doors? The aggressive specificity of her rapid-fire questions hit me like a physical, heavy blow to the stomach. She did not actually care if I had miraculously survived the treacherous drive down the highway. She did not care about my failing health or my deep grief. She only cared about the barn. The very same barn secretly connected to a massive industrial power grid. I knew instantly that this sudden phone call was a carefully constructed trap. If I told her the absolute truth, if I foolishly told her I saw the fresh tire tracks and the thick electrical cables, I would undeniably be signing my own death warrant tonight. I needed to make her confidently believe that her cruel pharmacological plan had worked flawlessly. I needed her to firmly believe that I was exactly what Cameron had arrogantly called me earlier today. A clueless, useless old man who posed zero threat. I slouched much deeper into the dusty armchair, pressing the phone tightly against my ear, and let out a long, pathetic groan. I slurred my carefully chosen words, heavily dragging out my syllables to sound utterly exhausted, mentally defeated, and deeply confused. No, Monica, I mumbled weakly, forcing my vocal cords to tremble realistically. I did not go outside at all. I am so incredibly tired right now. Those special pills you generously gave me earlier. They made me so incredibly dizzy on the road. My vision is entirely blurred right now. I can barely even stand up straight without falling over. I just dragged my heavy body into the living room and collapsed into a chair. I think I am going to sleep for a solid week. I cannot even begin to think about walking out into the dark to explore some old barn right now. I just need to close my heavy eyes and rest my body. There was a sharp, sudden, and highly calculating pause on the other end of the telephone line. I could distinctly hear her breathing rapidly, calculating her next strategic move in the dark. When she finally spoke again, the frantic, desperate edge in her voice had completely vanished, replaced quickly by a smooth, chillingly dark satisfaction. "Oh, Dad, I am so deeply sorry. The long drive took so much out of your system," she cooed softly, sounding deeply and genuinely relieved by my fake symptoms. "You just rest now. Do not worry about exploring the property tonight. Just stay securely inside the house and sleep deeply. We will talk again in a few days. Goodbye." The line instantly went dead. She did not say she loved me. She did not offer to drive up and check on me. She just coldly hung up, entirely satisfied that the heavy, unmarked sedatives had done their sinister job perfectly. I lowered the silent phone slowly, staring blankly into the dark, empty room. The terrifying pieces were finally locking into a cohesive place. The mysterious pills were specifically meant to incapacitate my body, to keep me entirely out of the way, or perhaps to make absolutely sure I never woke up from my sleep at all. They wanted me to be completely physically helpless tonight. I stood up slowly from the dusty armchair, my sharp mind racing wildly with terrifying, dangerous possibilities. If Monica was so desperately concerned about whether or not I had entered that specific barn, it meant there was something incredibly valuable hidden inside it that she and my treacherous son desperately needed tonight. Something they were more than willing to chemically drug me for. I walked slowly across the loudly creaking floorboards, moving quietly toward the front of the isolated farmhouse. The large bay window in the front living room was heavily covered in decades of thick grime and featured several large, dangerous cracks running diagonally through the fragile glass. I carefully peeked through a relatively clear section of the broken pane, looking out into the expansive, totally overgrown front yard and the long, winding dirt road leading all the way back to the main highway. The bright moon had finally risen, casting a pale silver glow over the silent valley. The dark night was incredibly still and peaceful. I scanned the distant horizon carefully, actively searching for any sign of approaching movement. At first, there was absolutely nothing out there but the gentle swaying of the dry brush moving in the cold wind. But then my sharp eyes caught something moving ominously in the far distance. About a mile down the rugged, uneven dirt road, two bright, glaring headlights forcefully pierced through the thick darkness. A large vehicle was steadily approaching the isolated property. I held my breath tightly, watching the lights intently. Suddenly, the bright headlights snapped off entirely, plunging the approaching vehicle into total, absolute darkness. But the faint, highly rhythmic crunch of heavy tires rolling aggressively over loose gravel continued echoing in the silent night. I squinted hard through the cracked, dirty glass, my racing heart hammering furiously and painfully against my ribcage. A large, menacing black SUV slowly emerged from the deep shadows of the tree line. It was creeping deliberately toward the farmhouse at a predatory, agonizingly slow pace, operating entirely in stealth mode without any lights. They had not come all this way just to check on my physical well-being. They had come to violently finish the job. The massive black vehicle rolled to a silent stop near the edge of the overgrown gravel driveway, barely 100 yards from the decaying front porch where I stood hidden behind the cracked glass. The engine was cut immediately. They sat in the dark, observing the farmhouse, waiting for a response. My heart was thumping a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but my mind rapidly shifted into a state of cold, calculated survival. My immediate urge was to dial 911 and beg the local authorities to send a patrol car. But I stopped my thumb. Cameron was not just a greedy, entitled son anymore. He was a highly connected, wealthy executive who routinely rubbed elbows with local politicians, judges, and law enforcement officials. He funded political campaigns across Southern California. If I called the local police in a panic, claiming my son sent hitmen to a remote farm, it was entirely possible the responding officers were already on his payroll. Or worse, They would simply write me off as a delusional old man suffering from a severe cognitive breakdown, exactly the narrative Monica had been planting. I could not risk placing my life in the hands of strangers who might be bought and paid for. I needed someone I could trust implicitly. I needed someone who knew how to handle a violent, life-threatening situation in the dead of night. I scrolled quickly past the emergency numbers on my phone and found the contact for Victor. Victor and I had been best friends for over 40 years. Before entering the private security sector, he spent 2 decades as a highly decorated reconnaissance Marine serving in the most hostile environments on the planet. If anyone knew how to handle a tactical ambush, it was him. I pressed the call button and lifted the phone to my ear, keeping my breathing shallow. The line rang only twice before he answered. His voice was gravelly and alert. I did not waste a single second on pleasantries. "Victor," I whispered into the receiver, my voice trembling slightly. "I am in serious trouble. I am out at the old Ojai property, the one Sarah bought years ago. There is a black vehicle parked right outside the tree line operating entirely in stealth mode. They killed their headlights before pulling up, and they are just sitting there. I think Cameron sent them to get rid of me." There was absolute silence on the other end. Victor did not ask if I was joking. He did not ask if I was overreacting to the shadows. He simply processed the tactical information instantly. "Give me your exact coordinates, Dick," he said, his tone shifting into icy military efficiency. I recited the address from memory, my eyes never leaving the vehicle outside. "I am 20 minutes away if I push the engine," Victor replied. "Do not engage them under any circumstances. Keep your phone silent, stay out of sight, and find a heavy weapon, just in case they breach the perimeter before I arrive. I am on my way." He hung up. I slipped the phone into my jacket pocket and slowly backed away from the front window, placing each footstep with agonizing care to avoid the creaking floorboards. I needed a weapon, something heavy and solid that could do actual damage if I was forced into a physical confrontation. I moved silently through the dark hallway toward the rear of the house, letting my memory of the floor plan guide my movements. The kitchen was a desolate space bathed in the pale moonlight filtering through dirty back windows. I ran my hands over the decaying countertops and opened a few rusted drawers, finding nothing but brittle wood and ancient dust. Then my foot brushed against something cold and solid resting on the floor near the door. I crouched down and swept my hand over the linoleum, my fingers wrapping around a heavy iron crowbar. It was covered in rust and old paint left behind by whoever boarded up the house years ago, but it was perfectly balanced and incredibly dangerous in the right hands. I gripped the cold iron tightly, feeling a sudden surge of adrenaline flood my tired muscles. I was 70 years old, but I was absolutely not going to simply lie down and let my incredibly ungrateful son order my execution without putting up a brutal, bloody fight. I pressed my back against the kitchen wall and carefully reached for the brass handle of the rear door. It was stiff fighting against my grip, but I applied steady pressure until the latch finally clicked open with a barely audible metallic pop. I eased the door open just wide enough to slip my body through the narrow gap and stepped quietly out into the freezing night air. The backyard was heavily overgrown with thick brush and tall, dead grass, providing me with excellent natural cover. I crouched down low, letting the dense vegetation conceal my silhouette, and slowly maneuvered my way around the side of the house toward the front driveway. I moved with agonizing caution, ensuring my heavy boots did not snap any dry twigs. When I finally reached the corner of the rotting porch, I peered carefully through the bushes. The doors of the black vehicle quietly swung open. 2 men stepped out onto the gravel. They were not common street thugs or cheap local criminals. They were dressed in high-end black tactical gear from head to toe. They wore heavy Kevlar vests, dark combat boots, and black fabric masks that completely covered their faces. In their hands, they carried sleek firearms equipped with long cylindrical sound suppressors. These men were highly trained, heavily armed professionals moving with terrifying synchronized military precision. They communicated entirely through subtle hand signals, their movements devoid of hesitation. One of the men reached into a tactical pouch on his chest and pulled out a complex electronic device. Even from my hidden vantage point, I recognized the distinct glowing interface of a biometric bypass scanner. It was a highly specialized piece of equipment used exclusively by high-level security firms to hack into advanced digital locking mechanisms. Why would a hit squad need a biometric scanner to break into a decaying farmhouse? The terrifying answer presented itself almost immediately. The two armed men did not turn toward the front porch. They did not even glance at the broken windows of the main house where they supposedly believed I was sleeping off a heavy dose of narcotics. Instead, they completely bypassed the residential structure, turning their backs to the farmhouse entirely. They raised their suppressed weapons to a ready position and began marching silently through the muddy grass, heading directly toward the massive metal barn at the far edge of the property. They were completely and utterly ignoring me. They were going straight for whatever my wife Sarah had hidden behind those heavy doors. I tightened my grip on the rusted iron crowbar, my breathing shallow and controlled. I waited until they were 50 yards ahead, their dark figures blending into the night, before I stepped out from the dense brush. I lowered my center of gravity and began to follow them into the darkness, stepping precisely in their muddy footprints to avoid making a sound. The cold night air bit into my lungs as I crept forward, keeping my boots firmly planted in the deep impressions left by the armed intruders. The tall, dying grass brushed against my dark jacket, but I moved with agonizing slowness to ensure not a single blade snapped under my weight. 50 yards became 15. I could clearly see the faint green lights on their tactical vests. They were standing right in front of the massive corrugated metal doors of the barn, speaking to each other in hushed, clipped tones. One adjusted the biometric scanner near the doorframe, while the other kept his suppressed weapon raised. My grip on the rusted iron crowbar was so tight my forearms cramped. I was 70 years old. I was in good shape, but pitting myself against two highly trained professionals in their physical prime was practically suicide. Yet the thought of Cameron sending ghosts to murder me completely erased my fear. I was about to step out from behind a rotting tractor tire to swing the heavy iron bar at the nearest guard when a sudden silent shadow detached itself from the dense tree line to my right. A large hand clamped down firmly over my mouth, and an incredibly strong arm pinned my chest against the cold metal. I thrashed wildly for a split second before a familiar gravelly voice whispered directly into my ear. "It is just me, Dick. Stay perfectly still." Victor had arrived. He let go of my mouth and crouched beside me in the mud. He wore dark clothing and moved with a ghostly fluidity that defied his age. He did not ask me if I was okay. He simply analyzed the tactical layout in front of us with cold, clinical precision. "Two Tango's heavy armor suppressed rifles," Victor whispered, his eyes locked onto the targets. "We take them simultaneously on my mark. I take the one on the left. You take the right. Do not aim for the head or chest, they have Kevlar. Aim for the back of the knees, drop them to the dirt, and I will handle the rest. Do you understand?" I nodded, my heart hammering a furious rhythm against my ribs. I tightened my sweaty grip on the heavy iron crowbar. Victor held up 3 fingers in the pale moonlight. Then 2, then 1. We moved out of the brush like twin shadows. The element of absolute surprise was our only advantage. I rushed forward, closing the gap with a burst of desperate adrenaline I did not know I possessed. The guard on the right heard the crunch of gravel beneath my boots and began to pivot, bringing his weapon up toward my chest. But he was just a fraction of a second too late. I swung the rusted crowbar with all my strength, aiming low exactly as Victor had instructed. The heavy iron collided with the back of the man's right knee with a sickening, wet crunch. The guard let out a muffled, agonizing grunt as his leg completely buckled beneath him, dropping him instantly to the muddy ground. His weapon slipped from his hands, clattering harmlessly against the barn. Before he could attempt to recover, Victor was finishing his target. Victor had closed the distance in absolute silence, wrapping his massive forearm around the first guard's neck in an inescapable chokehold, while simultaneously sweeping the man's legs out from under him. The guard thrashed violently, but the former Marine held him in a vice grip that entirely cut off the blood flow to his brain. Within 10 seconds, the man went completely limp, dropping into the mud like a discarded ragdoll. My target was still writhing on the ground, frantically reaching for a tactical knife strapped to his thigh. I stepped forward heavily, slamming the heel of my thick work boot down onto his wrist and pinning his hand to the earth. Victor moved with terrifying speed, leaving the unconscious guard and diving onto my target. He delivered a single devastating strike to the side of the man's jaw. The guard's eyes rolled back in his head, and his body instantly went slack. The sudden violent scuffle was over in less than 30 seconds. The night returned to a dead, eerie silence, interrupted only by the ragged sound of my own breathing. I stood there in the dark, my chest heaving violently, staring down at the two unconscious men lying motionless in the dirt at my feet. My arms were shaking uncontrollably from the massive dump of adrenaline, and my knees felt like they were made of water. I leaned heavily against the cold metal siding of the barn, using the rusted crowbar to keep myself upright. Victor did not waste a single second celebrating our miraculous victory. He immediately pulled a bundle of heavy-duty plastic zip ties from his jacket pocket. He expertly rolled the first guard onto his stomach, crossing the man's arms behind his back and securing his wrists with ruthless efficiency. He did the same to the second guard, pulling the thick plastic bands so tightly they dug deeply into the flesh. Then he secured their ankles together, ensuring they could not walk or fight even if they managed to wake up. "Keep an eye on the tree line," Victor muttered rapidly, patting down the tactical vests of the subdued men. "Make absolutely sure they did not leave a driver waiting back in that vehicle." I scanned the dark road, watching the unmoving silhouette of the black SUV parked in the distance. Nothing was moving. We were completely alone. Victor systematically stripped the men of their suppressed firearms, tossing the lethal weapons far out into the tall weeds where they could not be retrieved. He checked their ankle holsters, confiscating 2 sharp tactical knives, and then began digging through the deep pockets of their heavy combat pants. He pulled out encrypted cell phones, a small flashlight, and the sophisticated biometric scanner they had been trying to use on the barn doorframe. I stepped closer, aiming my flashlight down at the items on the muddy ground. "See if they have identification," I whispered. Victor reached into the first guard's vest and pulled out a small object. He wiped mud off the surface and held it into the light. It was a sleek, heavy electronic keycard. The front was matte black, featuring a prominent silver logo. I felt the air leave my lungs as I stared at that logo. I recognized the shape instantly. It was the exact emblem printed on the business cards my son had proudly handed me 3 months ago for his brand new private investment firm in Los Angeles. My own flesh and blood had dispatched his corporate security operatives to murder me. Victor did not offer useless words. He simply pressed the keycard flat against a hidden sensor on the barn frame. A loud electronic lock disengaged with a deep clack. I pulled the heavy corrugated metal door open. The inside of the structure was not filled with rotting wood or hay. I froze completely. Standing 3 feet inside the wooden facade was a massive reinforced steel bulkhead. It looked like the entrance to a military bunker, complete with thick titanium hinges and a glowing digital retinal scanner. I stood frozen in this cold air, staring at the digital retinal scanner mounted beside the steel bulkhead. The scale of the engineering hidden inside this rotting barn was staggering. The titanium hinges and reinforced steel plating were designed to withstand a military assault. Victor stepped past me, his combat boots making no sound on the concrete slab beyond the wooden threshold. He examined the door with the detachment of a man who had breached fortified compounds worldwide. He ran his gloved hand along the seamless edge where the steel met the concrete frame. "There are no wires, external power boxes, or keyholes," Victor stated quietly. "This is a closed-loop biometric security system. The keycard we took from the guards was only coded for the outer facade. Getting through this inner bulkhead requires a direct retinal scan, or a master override code entered directly into the keypad. Without biometrics, blowing this door requires shaped charges we do not have. I stepped closer to the glowing red panel, my mind racing through decades of memories. Cameron and Monica clearly did not possess the required biometrics or the bypass code. This explained why they sent a specialized tactical team with an advanced hacking device. But this bunker did not belong to my son. It belonged to my wife. Sarah meticulously planned every detail of our lives' finances and future. She lived by spreadsheets, encrypted passwords, and fail-safes. If she had built this underground fortress in absolute secrecy, she would never have left me completely locked out. She knew my technical limitations, and she knew I would eventually find my way to this property. I stared at the keypad glowing beneath the optical lens, desperate for a solution. The blinking cursor demanded a 10-digit sequence. My chest tightened as a painful memory pushed to the forefront of my mind. I remembered sitting in the sterile hospital room during Sarah's final days. The cancer ravaged her body, and the heavy doses of morphine seemingly eroded her brilliant mind. During those agonizing last 48 hours, she had drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering quietly to herself. Cameron had stood in the corner of the room, checking his emails loudly, complaining that his mother was losing her grip on reality. At the time, I had sadly agreed with him. Sarah had kept repeating a specific random sequence of numbers, her frail fingers gripping my hand with surprising strength. 4, 7, 9, 2. She whispered those digits repeatedly, her cloudy eyes locking onto mine with a fierce intensity I foolishly chalked up to terminal delirium. I spent hours stroking her hair, telling her to rest, ignoring the vital message she was desperately passing to me before her final breath. She was not losing her mind. She was leaving me the key. A profound wave of sorrow and immense clarity washed over my tired body. Sarah had known her time was critically short, and she knew she could not trust our son. She used her final moments of lucidity to give me the exact combination I needed to uncover the truth. But 4 digits were not enough. The digital interface demanded a full 10-digit sequence. I closed my eyes, tuning out the low hum of the industrial power grid vibrating through the concrete floor. I needed to think exactly like Sarah. She was a woman of deep sentiment wrapped in practical logic. If she needed a 10-digit code, I would never forget she would combine her secret numbers with the most important date of our shared lives. Our wedding anniversary. August 14th, 1982, 08-14-1982. That was 8 digits. If I dropped the century, it became a 6-digit sequence. 08-14-802. Combined with the 4 specific numbers she whispered on her deathbed, it equaled exactly 10 digits. Victor watched me in absolute silence as I reached my trembling hand toward the glowing red keypad. The cool night air seemed to vanish, entirely replaced by a suffocating, heavy tension. If I entered the wrong code, a system this advanced would trigger a hard lockdown, sealing the steel door and instantly alerting whoever was monitoring the security grid. I took a deep breath, letting the memory of Sarah guide my fingers. I typed the first 6 digits. 0, 8, 1, 4, 8, 2. The keypad emitted a series of soft electronic beeps, registering the numerical input. I paused for a fraction of a second, my heart hammering furiously against my ribs. I entered the final 4 numbers she had given me. 4, 7, 9, 2. I pressed the green confirmation key and stepped back, holding my breath. For 3 agonizing seconds, absolutely nothing happened. The red optical scanner blinked rhythmically, silently, processing the numerical entry. Then the red light suddenly shifted to a bright, vibrant green. A deep, heavy mechanical thud echoed from within the thick steel wall, followed immediately by the unmistakable hiss of depressurizing hydraulic seals. The titanium hinges groaned loudly as the incredibly heavy bulkhead slowly began to swing outward, releasing a rush of crisp, perfectly chilled air into the dusty outer barn. Victor instantly raised his confiscated tactical knife, stepping protectively in front of me as the heavy door fully opened, but there was no immediate physical threat waiting for us inside the bunker. There was only the steady, rhythmic hum of high-powered electronics. We stepped cautiously over the thick steel threshold and entered a completely different world. The interior of the bunker was a pristine, meticulously clean, climate-controlled environment. The walls were lined with thick soundproofing panels, entirely eliminating the howling wind outside. Bright, sterile LED lights automatically flickered to life, illuminating rows of towering black computer server racks. Thousands of green and blue lights blinked across the advanced hardware processing a massive amount of encrypted data. Thick bundles of black cables ran seamlessly from the servers into the concrete floor, drawing energy from the hidden industrial power line outside. This was not just a simple storage facility. It was a highly sophisticated multi-million-dollar off-grid data center. Victor swept his tactical gaze across the humming machines, his sharp eyes scanning the room for hidden cameras or silent alarms. At the very back of the long rectangular room, past the endless rows of heavily encrypted servers, stood another massive titanium structure. It was a heavily reinforced walk-in banking vault gleaming under the bright fluorescent lights. The sheer amount of capital required to secretly build and maintain this subterranean infrastructure was absolutely astronomical. But it was not the towering servers or the imposing titanium vault that made my blood run entirely cold. Sitting perfectly centered on a polished stainless steel desk in the middle of the room, directly under a single overhead spotlight, was a pristine white envelope. I walked slowly down the aisle between the humming server racks, my heavy boots echoing loudly against the polished concrete floor. As I approached the desk, the bold, familiar handwriting across the envelope came into sharp, undeniable focus. It was written in thick black ink, addressed simply to me. For my beloved husband, Richard. My hands were shaking so violently that I could barely pick up the pristine white envelope from the polished steel desk. The thick paper felt incredibly heavy, carrying the weight of a ghost speaking to me from beyond the grave. I ran my thumb over my name, tracing the familiar curves of Sarah's elegant handwriting. Beside me, Victor remained a stoic, silent guardian. He moved away from the center of the room, positioning himself strategically near the open steel bulkhead, his eyes constantly scanning the dark perimeter of the barn outside. He knew exactly what this moment meant to me, and he was ensuring that I had the uninterrupted time I desperately needed. I took a deep, ragged breath, letting the chilled, filtered air of the bunker fill my burning lungs, and carefully broke the wax seal on the back of the envelope. I unfolded the thick parchment paper. The date at the top of the page was written 3 weeks before she was admitted to the hospital for her final fatal decline. The ink was slightly smudged, as if she had been crying while writing the words. I swallowed the thick knot forming in my throat and began to read. "My dearest William," she began, the words flooding my heart with a profound, agonizing sorrow. "If you are standing in this room, it means my absolute worst fears have been realized. It means I am gone, and it means you have finally followed the breadcrumbs I left behind to uncover the horrible truth about our family. I am so sorry for leaving you in the dark for the past 2 years. I needed to protect you, and the only way to keep you safe from the crossfire was to make you look like a harmless, ignorant old man. Please forgive my deception. I did not build this bunker because I was losing my mind, and I did not alter my last will and testament out of spite or cruelty. I did it because I discovered something truly terrifying about our son, and I needed time to secure our true legacy before he could steal it all and destroy everything we worked our entire lives to build." I gripped the paper tighter, my knuckles turning completely white. Sarah had always been a master forensic accountant, a brilliant woman who could spot a single irregular decimal point in a mountain of financial data. The letter continued, detailing a nightmare I could scarcely comprehend. 2 years ago, Cameron asked me to review the initial financial ledgers for his new private investment firm, Sarah wrote. He thought I would glance at the top-line profits and congratulate him on his newfound success. But I looked deeper. I followed the hidden money trails, William. I tracked the complex routing numbers, the offshore shell companies, and the layered dummy accounts he and Monica were aggressively setting up. Our son is not a legitimate investment banker. He is running a massive, highly sophisticated money laundering operation for a notorious international cartel. He is moving millions of dollars of illicit drug money through the domestic real estate market, and he was quietly planning to use your development company as his primary washing machine. A wave of icy nausea washed over my body. My vision blurred as the horrifying reality of the situation crashed into my brain. The unmarked white pills, the sudden aggressive transfer of the luxury penthouse, the heavily armed tactical team sent to the remote farm. It all made perfect, terrifying sense now. Cameron and Monica were not greedy children waiting for an inheritance. They were desperate criminals trapped in a high-stakes underworld, and they viewed me as a massive liability that needed to be neutralized. If Cameron had succeeded in taking over my real estate portfolio, he would have dragged my clean name into a massive federal investigation, or worse, put me into the crosshairs of a ruthless criminal syndicate. Sarah had figured it all out, and she had spent her final painful years meticulously sabotaging his sinister plans right under his nose. I wiped a single tear from my cheek and continued reading the next paragraph. I knew that if I confronted Cameron directly, he would panic and try to silence me, she explained. So I played the role of a declining paranoid mother. I used my extensive financial connections to secretly liquidate the vast majority of our liquid assets, our stock portfolios, our hidden mutual funds, and our overseas accounts. I quietly converted over $40 million into untraceable decentralized assets and secured physical bonds. I hid the true family fortune right here in this vault, entirely out of his reach. I left him the luxury penthouse and the visible bank accounts to serve as a shiny distraction, a temporary pacifier to keep him occupied while I finished securing our real wealth. He thinks he won, William. He thinks he outsmarted us both and walked away with the crown jewels, but he only took the bait. The very final few sentences of the letter were written with a fierce, protective intensity that practically radiated off the page. The pen strokes were dark and heavy. I paused, reading the most chilling revelation of all. If you are reading this, William, my heart finally gave out. Or they helped it give out. Open the safe. Don't let our son destroy your life. The air in the bunker suddenly felt infinitely colder. My breath caught sharply in my throat as the devastating implication of those words hit my brain. Sarah had known her illness was terminal, but she also strongly suspected that Cameron and Monica were actively accelerating her demise to gain immediate access to the estate. They had probably used the exact same heavy sedatives on her that Monica had slipped into my hand just hours ago. They had murdered my beautiful wife. I let out a low, ragged sound of unadulterated anguish. Victor turned his head slightly, his dark eyes locking onto mine with silent, supportive understanding. He did not speak, but the rigid posture of his body told me everything I needed to know. He was ready to go to war for me. I gently folded the heavy parchment paper and slipped it into the inner pocket of my jacket. The profound grief that had been completely suffocating me for the past month rapidly began to transform into something entirely different. It condensed, hardening into a sharp, unbreakable spear of righteous fury. I was no longer an old, confused widower, grieving the natural loss of his beloved wife. I was a man who had just discovered that his own son was a monstrous, greedy murderer, and my incredibly brilliant wife had just handed me the ultimate weapon to exact complete, devastating justice. I turned away from the steel desk and walked with slow, deliberate purpose toward the massive titanium vault dominating the back wall of the bunker. I reached out my fingers, no longer shaking, but perfectly steady and resolute. Using the final code in the letter, I spin the dial on the titanium safe. The heavy door swings open, revealing stacks of documents that will rewrite my entire existence. I stood there bathed in the cool, sterile light of the bunker, completely mesmerized by the contents stacked neatly inside the impregnable steel cavity. There were no piles of cash or glittering gold bars, but to a seasoned real estate developer, what I was looking at was infinitely more valuable. The shelves were meticulously organized with thick waterproof portfolios, ledgers, and banded stacks of heavy parchment paper. I reached out with trembling fingers and carefully pulled the first banded stack from the top shelf. They were bearer bonds. I flipped through the crisp embossed pages, my breath catching sharply in my throat as I mentally tallied the staggering denominations. There were millions of dollars held in these untraceable certificates alone. I set them down on the stainless steel desk next to Sarah's letter and reached back into the vault, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Next came thick files containing deeds and transfer documents for high-yield offshore accounts, established in secure jurisdictions far beyond the reach of American financial regulators or our greedy sun. Beside them sat heavily sealed envelopes containing extensive mineral rights and lucrative land patents for properties I did not even know we owned. I stood completely motionless, calculating the sheer magnitude of the hidden fortune meticulously laid out before me. The combined value of these decentralized assets easily exceeded $80 million. It was a staggering revelation. Over the past 3 years, while she was battling a terminal illness and pretending to be a frail, declining old woman, my brilliant wife had executed a financial masterclass. Sarah had slowly, methodically, and invisibly siphoned the vast majority of our legitimate wealth out of our visible accounts. She had quietly liquidated our most vulnerable assets and funneled every single penny into this impenetrable underground fortress. This rotting, decaying farmhouse in the middle of nowhere was nothing more than a brilliant, worthless decoy. She had cleverly purchased a dead asset, specifically to conceal an $80 million empire directly under the nose of a son who believed he was manipulating her. A profound wave of awe and deep sorrow washed over my tired body. Sarah had moved mountains to protect our life's work from Cameron and his treacherous wife. She had successfully shielded me from a total financial ruin. But as I stared at the towering stacks of documents, a sudden piercing question cut through my quiet reverence. If Sarah had deliberately drained our primary accounts to protect our wealth from our son, why had she explicitly amended her will to leave him our $12 million luxury penthouse? The penthouse was our crown jewel, the very symbol of our success in the city. It was a massive, highly visible asset with crippling property taxes and exorbitant maintenance fees. It completely contradicted her master plan to leave him with nothing but a liability. I frowned, the cold air of the bunker suddenly feeling a degree sharper. There had to be a specific reason. Sarah never did anything without a calculated purpose. I turned back to the titanium vault, running my hands along the deeper recessed shelves. Tucked away in the very bottom corner, intentionally separated from the bearer bonds and offshore deeds, was a thick, bright red folder. It was marked with a single ominous word written in Sarah's sharp handwriting. Liability. I pulled the heavy red folder from the vault and carried it over to the steel desk. I untied the string closure and flipped open the thick cardboard cover. Inside were dozens of pages of highly detailed, complex forensic accounting ledgers. My eyes scanned the rows of numbers, following the intricate highlighted pathways Sarah had painstakingly mapped out. She had tracked every single financial transaction connected to the luxury penthouse over the last 24 months. What I saw on those pages made my blood run entirely cold, freezing the air in my lungs. The $12 million penthouse was not a free and clear asset. It was fully, dangerously leveraged. Cameron had secretly used his proximity to our accounts and Monica's legal connections to take out multiple massive high-interest loans against the property without my knowledge. But the loans were just the tip of a terrifying, bloody iceberg. Sarah's meticulous notes detailed a horrifying, complex web of illicit financial activity. Cameron and Monica were using the penthouse as a pristine, legitimate front to launder millions of dollars for an incredibly violent international drug cartel. They were filtering dirty money through fake renovations, phantom contractor invoices, and dummy shell companies, all tied directly to the address of our primary residence. They had turned our beautiful home into the central hub of a major criminal enterprise. The sheer scale of their illegal operation was staggering, and the implications were absolutely devastating. I gripped the edge of the steel desk to steady my trembling legs as the horrifying truth finally snapped into place. If Sarah had allowed the penthouse to pass to me in the will, I would have inherited the legal ownership of a massive money laundering front. I would have been the single name listed on the deed when the federal authorities inevitably raided the property. The Federal Bureau of Investigation would have arrested me, frozen all my remaining assets, and thrown me into federal prison for the rest of my natural life. Or even worse, the cartel would have eventually realized the federal heat was closing in. They would have needed a convenient disposable scapegoat to take the fall for their missing millions. They would have silenced me permanently, leaving my body in an alleyway to tie up their loose ends. Sarah had seen the trap Cameron had laid for me. She had seen the federal indictments and the cartel assassins waiting in the shadows. And so in her final act of profound love and fierce protection, my beautiful, brilliant wife had flipped the trap entirely. She deliberately gave the penthouse to Cameron. She intentionally handed him the legal ownership of his own criminal hub. She removed my name from the blast radius and effectively tied the noose securely around our son's treacherous neck. She gave him the penthouse to let him hang himself with his own rope. He thought he had outsmarted us and secured a massive asset, completely unaware that his mother had just legally bound him to a ticking time bomb. I stared down at the bright red folder, a sharp, highly dangerous smile slowly spreading across my face. Sarah had not just bravely saved my life. She had given me the ultimate, perfect weapon to completely destroy the corrupt people who had actively tried to bury me. I carefully closed the red folder and placed it securely in my left jacket pocket, alongside her heartfelt letter. The raw, paralyzing grief that had consumed me for weeks was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. I turned away from the desk and walked slowly back toward the open steel bulkhead. I stepped out of the bunker and back into the dim barn. Victor was standing exactly where I left him. "Let us wake our sleeping guests," I whispered. "We have a lot of important work to do tonight." Victor nodded silently, his face a mask of stone in the harsh fluorescent lighting. We left the two mercenaries securely bound in the freezing mud and walked back through the heavy titanium doors of the climate-controlled bunker. The sheer hum of the towering black server racks seemed entirely different now. It was no longer just the sound of hidden wealth. It was the mechanical heartbeat of Sarah's final desperate attempt to communicate with me from beyond the grave. I set the heavy red folder down on the polished steel desk and turned my attention to the primary computer terminal. Victor moved past me, pulling out a heavy tactical keyboard connected directly to the master server. He typed rapidly, his fingers flying across the keys with the practiced efficiency of a military intelligence officer. Sarah had built an impenetrable digital fortress, but she had also left the front gate wide open for anyone possessing the correct biometric clearance and the bypass code. A bright blue screen flickered to life, illuminating Victor's hardened features. He accessed the primary directory, bringing up a neatly categorized list of encrypted files. There were thousands of financial ledgers, wire transfer receipts, and offshore banking logs. But one specific folder located right on the main desktop stood out immediately. It was labeled with my name, and beneath it was a subfolder simply titled Investigator Files. I leaned over Victor's broad shoulder, my chest tightening with a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. Sarah had hired a private investigator before she passed away. She knew she was surrounded by vipers, and she needed undeniable concrete proof of their venom. Victor clicked on this folder. A long, detailed list of high-definition video files populated the screen. Each file was meticulously named with specific dates and timestamps. The dates corresponded exactly to the final 2 weeks Sarah had spent trapped in the luxury VIP wing of Cedars Sinai Medical Center. My heart hammered violently against my ribs as a cold, sickening realization began to wash over me. She had ordered her private investigator to secretly install hidden cameras inside her own hospital room. She wanted every single moment of her final days documented and preserved in this underground vault. Victor glanced up at me, his dark eyes reflecting a deep, silent warning. "Are you absolutely sure you are prepared to watch this?" "William," he asked quietly. I swallowed the thick knot forming in my dry throat and nodded my head. "Play the final video," I whispered, my voice sounding incredibly fragile in the humming room. Victor double-clicked the last file on the screen. The video player expanded to fill the monitor. The high-definition footage showed Sarah lying incredibly still in her sterile hospital bed, hooked up to a complex array of medical monitors and intravenous drips. She looked so fragile, so entirely consumed by the brutal illness. The timestamp in the corner indicated it was recorded on a Tuesday evening, barely 3 hours before the hospital officially pronounced her dead. I felt a profound, suffocating sorrow, watching her chest rise and fall with slow, agonizing effort. But the quiet sorrow was instantly shattered when the heavy wooden door to her hospital room swung open. Cameron and Monica walked into the frame. They were dressed impeccably, completely unaffected by the grim atmosphere of the intensive care unit. Cameron wore a tailored navy suit, and Monica clutched a designer leather handbag. They stood at the foot of Sarah's bed, staring down at my dying wife with a level of cold, detached impatience that made my stomach churn violently. Cameron checked his expensive wristwatch, letting out a heavy, irritated sigh. The audio feed from the hidden camera was crystal clear, capturing every single word echoing in the quiet room. "The cartel needs the Penthouse transferred to my name by Friday," Cameron said, his voice entirely devoid of any human empathy or filial affection. "She is taking entirely too long to die." The sheer brutality of his words struck me like a physical blow to the jaw. My own son, the boy I had raised, the boy I had protected and provided for his entire life, was standing over his mother's deathbed, complaining that her lingering survival was inconveniencing a ruthless criminal syndicate. I stopped breathing entirely. Monica stepped forward, moving with a chilling, calculated grace. She unzipped her leather handbag and pulled out a small, unmarked medical syringe filled with a clear, unknown liquid. "We cannot afford to wait for nature to take its course, Cameron," Monica whispered, her voice laced with a dark, terrifying pragmatism. "If the transfer is delayed, those people will come after us. They will not accept excuses from a grieving family." I watched the screen in absolute horror, my hands gripping the edge of the steel desk so tightly my knuckles ached. Monica moved quickly to the side of the hospital bed. She leaned over my helpless wife, her face completely expressionless, and injected the clear liquid directly into Sarah's primary intravenous line. The reaction was almost instantaneous. Sarah's fragile body arched violently off the mattress. She began to convulse, her arms thrashing weakly against the sterile white sheets. The medical monitors next to her bed immediately began to flash red, emitting a series of shrill, frantic alarms. Cameron did not rush to hold her hand. He did not call for the nurses. He simply stood there watching his mother fight for her final breaths with the cold, calculating detachment of a slaughterhouse butcher. 10 agonizing seconds later, Sarah went completely still. The monitors flatlined, emitting a continuous, deafening electronic wail. Monica calmly dropped the empty syringe into a medical waste bin, smoothed down her skirt, and stepped back toward the door. "It is done," she said coldly. "Call the nurses and start crying." The video feed continued to roll, showing Cameron dramatically dropping to his knees and burying his face in his hands as the medical staff rushed frantically into the room. It was a perfect, sickening performance. My own son had murdered his mother for a piece of real estate. He had allowed his treacherous wife to execute the woman who gave him life, all to satisfy the bloody demands of an international drug cartel. I stood frozen in the cold bunker, staring blindly at the paused image of Sarah's lifeless body on the glowing screen. The profound, suffocating grief that had been crushing my soul for weeks vanished entirely. The heavy sorrow evaporated into the chilled air, replaced instantly by an icy, absolute rage that burned much hotter than the surface of the sun. The betrayal was total, unforgivable, and completely evil. They killed her, and they tried to kill me tonight. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the cold iron crowbar. I was going to systematically dismantle their entire lives. But before I could articulate my vengeance to Victor, the bunker plunged into sudden chaos. The bright fluorescent lights overhead flickered violently and abruptly snapped off. Then a massive deafening alarm began to scream loudly through the valley. The farm's outer perimeter alarm was officially going off right now. Loud, harsh sirens blared endlessly into the dark night. The deafening wail of the perimeter alarms completely shattered the sterile, humming silence of the underground bunker. Victor did not flinch. He immediately pivoted away from the glowing server rack and lunged toward a secondary command console positioned against the far wall of the reinforced room. His thick fingers danced rapidly across the mechanical keyboard, bringing a large bank of high-definition security monitors to life. Sarah had not just built a financial vault. She had engineered a highly sophisticated military-grade surveillance network that covered every single inch of the desolate Ojai property. I rushed to Victor's side, my heart hammering a frantic, painful rhythm against my ribs as the dark screens flickered, revealing multiple infrared and night vision camera angles. The sheer scale of the approaching threat materialized before my eyes. The two subdued scouts we had left bound in the mud were just the tip of a massive, heavily armed spear. Through the crystal-clear optical sensors, I watched in absolute horror as the decaying wooden gates at the main entrance of the property were violently splintered into 1,000 jagged pieces. 4 massive matte black armored sport utility vehicles tore aggressively up the long dirt driveway. They did not bother with stealth mode anymore. Their blinding high-beam headlights and mounted off-road light bars completely illuminated the overgrown valley, casting long, menacing shadows across the dying grass. The heavy vehicles moved in a tight, synchronized, tactical formation, tearing through the mud and crushing the dry brush beneath their reinforced tires. They bypassed the rotting main farmhouse entirely, their drivers clearly knowing exactly where their true target was located. They accelerated fiercely toward the back of the lot, surrounding the outer perimeter of the corrugated metal barn in a highly disciplined semicircular blockade. The doors of the 4 armored vehicles swung open simultaneously. Over a dozen heavily armed men poured out into the freezing night air. These were not common street criminals or low-level security contractors. They were hardened, highly trained cartel enforcers. They wore heavy tactical plate carriers over dark clothing, their faces concealed by black balaclavas. I watched through the glowing monitors as they moved with terrifying fluid precision, fanning out to secure the perimeter of the barn. They carried fully automatic assault rifles, heavy breaching equipment, and specialized tactical gear designed for a violent, overwhelming siege. The cold mechanical reality of the situation washed over me. This was a dedicated hit squad. They had been dispatched to completely eradicate any trace of human life on this property and tear this hidden bunker apart piece by piece. But it was the arrival of the lead vehicle that made the blood freeze entirely in my veins. The heavy armored door of the primary sport utility vehicle opened, and 2 familiar figures stepped out into the harsh, glaring illumination of the headlights. It was Cameron and Monica. They were no longer hiding behind the polished, sophisticated facade of wealthy Los Angeles investment bankers. Cameron was dressed in a dark tactical jacket, his face pale and contorted with a mixture of absolute desperation and vicious anger. Monica stood close beside him, the cold, calculating cruelty in her eyes clearly visible even through the grainy distortion of the night vision cameras. They had not stayed back in their luxurious penthouse to wait for a phone call, confirming my tragic accidental death. They had come here personally to watch me die. The horrifying realization hit me with the devastating force of a runaway freight train. Sarah's forensic accounting ledgers had perfectly mapped out the truth. Cameron and Monica were not criminal masterminds. They were drowning in a lethal, inescapable debt to the brutal international cartel. They had foolishly used their luxury real estate ventures to launder millions of dollars in dirty money, and they had somehow lost or squandered a massive portion of the cartel's capital. The brutal enforcers surrounding the barn were not here to serve my son. They were his violent babysitters. Cameron and Monica owed their ruthless bosses a massive fortune, and their very lives were currently hanging by a fraying thread. They needed the $80 million hidden inside this underground vault to pay off their blood debt and save their own skins. That was the entire reason Monica had frantically shoved those heavy sedatives into my hand earlier today. They needed me to drive out to this remote property, fall asleep, and quietly pass away from a massive chemically induced heart attack. With me entirely out of the picture, Cameron could step in as the sole surviving heir, claim the hidden bunker, and hand Sarah's meticulously protected fortune directly over to his cartel handlers. They had planned to use my tragic death to buy their own freedom. My mind reeled as I stared at the glowing monitors, watching my own flesh and blood coordinate a violent siege against my life. The profound, suffocating grief I had felt for the past month was now completely gone. It had been entirely consumed by a cold, hardened resolve. They had murdered the love of my life, and now they were actively trying to slaughter me. Victor stood silently beside me, his eyes locked onto the tactical displays. He analyzed the enemy deployment with the cold, detached logic of a veteran combat marine. We have a reinforced titanium bulkhead and a completely self-sustaining air filtration system. Victor stated, his gravelly voice remarkably steady despite the overwhelming odds outside. They cannot breach that door with standard explosives without collapsing the entire barn structure on top of themselves. We are secure in here for the immediate future, William. But we have absolutely no way out. We are completely boxed in. I nodded slowly, my hand slipping into my jacket pocket to touch the heavy parchment of Sarah's final letter. We did not need to run. We just needed to survive long enough to expose them. On the security monitors, I watched Cameron gesture frantically toward the front of the barn. Two cartel enforcers advanced cautiously, their weapons raised, sweeping the area with mounted tactical flashlights. It only took them a few seconds to discover the two unconscious scouts Victor and I had incapacitated and zip-tied in the mud. The enforcers shouted something indistinguishable, aiming their weapons at the shadows. Cameron's pale face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic as he looked down at his neutralized men. He realized instantly that his flawless, chemically induced assassination plan had failed completely. He realized that I was not asleep in the farmhouse, and I was not a confused, helpless old man. I was awake, I was aware, and I was locked inside the impenetrable vault containing his only salvation. Cameron snatched a heavy megaphone from the passenger seat of the vehicle. He marched aggressively toward the center of the dirt clearing, flanked immediately by two armed guards. He raised the device to his mouth, his voice echoing loudly through the silent valley, penetrating the thick soundproofing of the bunker with distorted, metallic clarity. "Dad, we know you are in the bunker. Open the door, hand over the bonds, and we will make your death quick." Just like Mom's. The echo of Cameron's voice over the megaphone faded into the heavy, soundproofed walls of the bunker, leaving a chilling silence in its wake. Just like Mom's. The sheer cruelty of his words, weaponizing my wife's murder to break my spirit, had the exact opposite effect. It crystallized my resolve. I did not feel fear. I felt a cold, mechanical precision take over my mind. Victor moved instantly, not needing a single command. He stepped back from the security monitors and approached the main control panel beside the massive titanium bulkhead. With a few rapid keystrokes, he initiated the secondary lockdown protocols. Heavy steel deadbolts, thick as tree trunks, slammed into place around the perimeter of the door with a series of deafening metallic thuds. The hydraulic seals pressurized further, locking us inside a veritable subterranean fortress. "Let them throw themselves against that steel," Victor muttered, his eyes fixed on the reinforced seams. "They are not getting through without heavy ordnance, and if they use explosives, they bury the prize they came to steal. I turned my back on the sealed door and walked to the polished steel desk. The high-definition monitors still glowed with the frozen image of Sarah's hospital room, a haunting reminder of exactly what we were fighting for. I sat down in the heavy leather chair, pulling the tactical keyboard toward me. Sarah had anticipated every single move Cameron would make. She had hidden the fortune, she had documented the murder, and she had mapped out the cartel's entire money laundering operation. But she was far too thorough to leave this bunker as simply a passive storage vault. She would have built a weapon, a final failsafe designed to completely annihilate her killers if they ever managed to breach the perimeter. I navigated away from the video files and accessed the primary directory of the master server. I opened the folder containing the forensic accounting ledgers and the offshore bank routing numbers. My eyes scanned the complex digital architecture, searching for anything out of the ordinary, anything that looked like a trigger. It took me less than 3 minutes to find it. Hidden deep within the system registry, disguised under a string of complex numerical codes that perfectly matched our wedding anniversary, was a single executable file. It was not a document or a spreadsheet. It was a highly sophisticated automated command program. The file was ominously titled Dead Man Switch. My hands hovered over the keys as I examined the properties of the hidden program. Sarah had coded a massive digital payload. It was meticulously designed to bypass any standard commercial firewalls and utilize a heavily encrypted virtual private network to transmit data simultaneously to multiple high-level federal agencies. I opened the routing instructions. The primary recipients were the local field office of the Drug Enforcement Administration and the Cybercrimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She had not just prepared a defense. She had prepared an absolute, inescapable digital execution for our son and his cartel handlers. I stared at the blinking cursor, feeling the immense weight of the moment pressing down on my shoulders. If I executed this file, there was no turning back. The moment the data packet hit the federal servers, Cameron and Monica would become the highest priority targets for the United States government. The cartel would immediately realize their domestic laundering hub had been catastrophically compromised, and they would ruthlessly hunt down everyone involved. My son had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. He had chosen money over blood. He had chosen greed over his mother's life. He had chosen to stand outside this bunker with armed murderers eagerly waiting to slaughter his own father. The time for parental mercy had violently expired. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the chilled air of the server room fill my lungs, and firmly pressed the enter key. The blue screen instantly shifted to a stark, blinding white. A command prompt window opened rapidly, scrolling through lines of complex code as the automated program sprang to life. A progress bar materialized in the center of the screen, tracking the massive data upload. I watched in grim satisfaction as Sarah's final act of vengeance launched into the digital ether. The system was actively encrypting and transmitting the horrifying high-definition video of Monica injecting the fatal dose into Sarah's intravenous line. It was simultaneously uploading every single page of the forensic accounting ledgers, perfectly detailing the fake renovations and dummy shell companies tied to the luxury penthouse. It compiled all the hidden offshore routing numbers, completely exposing the cartel's secret financial network. The transmission speed was incredible, utilizing a dedicated fiber optic line Sarah had secretly laid alongside the industrial power grid. 10%, 30%, 60%. I watched the green bar move across the screen, knowing that with every single megabyte transferred, the invisible noose around Cameron's neck grew tighter and tighter. He was standing outside in the freezing mud, demanding bearer bonds and mineral rights, completely unaware that his entire criminal empire was currently being delivered directly to the desks of federal prosecutors. 90%. 100%. The screen flashed a bright green confirmation message. Payload delivered. The evidence was gone safely secured in the hands of the authorities. The trap had been flawlessly, irreversibly sprung. A sudden violent sound shattered the quiet hum of the server room. It was not the dull thud of heavy gunfire or the hollow impact of bodies slamming against the metal facade outside. It was a high-pitched, agonizing screech of tearing metal. I spun around in the leather chair, my eyes locking onto the massive titanium bulkhead. A blinding, intense point of white-hot light suddenly pierced through the darkness of the outer barn, illuminating the narrow seam where the heavy steel door met the concrete frame. The sound grew exponentially louder, transforming into a furious roaring hiss that vibrated through the floorboards. Victor drew his tactical knife, stepping back from the door and positioning himself behind a row of server racks. "They are not waiting for us to surrender, William," he stated, his voice tight with adrenaline. "They brought a thermal lance." I stared in horror as a shower of white-hot sparks erupted from the edge of the titanium hinge. The cartel enforcers were using a high-powered cutting torch, burning magnesium rods at over 4,000 degrees to melt their way through the steel vault. A thick cloud of gray smoke began to fill the space between the outer facade and our secondary door. The glowing point of light began to inch downward, cutting a molten path through the reinforced plating. Rivers of liquid steel dripped onto the concrete, illuminating the bunker with a flickering orange glow. We had delivered the evidence, but the federal cavalry was miles away. We were trapped in a steel box, and the cartel was burning through our defense. The heavy titanium hinges groaned as the thermal lance sliced deeper into the locking mechanism. We only had minutes before the melted door gave way, bringing the full violent fury of the hit squad directly into the room. The heavy titanium hinges groaned as the thermal lance sliced deeper into the locking mechanism. We only had minutes before the melted door gave way, bringing the full violent fury of the hit squad directly into the room. The molten metal dripped onto the concrete floor like glowing liquid fire. The intense heat radiating from the breach was already beginning to raise the temperature inside our sealed subterranean fortress. Victor moved with the terrifying silent efficiency of a man who had spent his entire life preparing for the absolute worst-case scenario. He reached deep into the tactical harness he wore beneath his dark jacket and withdrew the lethal hardware he had methodically stripped from the two unconscious mercenaries we left bound in the mud outside. He slapped a heavy matte black semi-automatic pistol into my open palm. The weapon felt incredibly foreign and dangerously heavy in my trembling hand. I had spent my entire adult life building luxury real estate developments, not preparing for a violent underground gunfight. Victor did not offer any words of hollow comfort. He simply checked the magazine of his own confiscated firearm, slid the action back to chamber around with a sharp metallic clack, and gestured toward the dense humming aisles of the data center. "We need cover that can absorb high-caliber rifle fire," Victor commanded quietly, his eyes never leaving the bright burning ring slowly expanding across the center of the titanium door. "Move behind the primary server arrays. The steel casings and dense copper wiring will stop a standard bullet. Do not fire until they completely breach the threshold. We maintain the tactical advantage as long as they are forced to funnel through that narrow, smoking choke point." I gripped the heavy pistol tightly, my knuckles turning entirely white, and followed his urgent instructions. I pressed my back against the vibrating metal cabinet of the master server rack. The smell of burning magnesium and melting steel grew stronger, seeping through the microscopic cracks in the heavy door seals. The suffocating tension in the room was physically agonizing. Every single second felt like an eternity suspended in absolute terror. As I crouched behind the humming machines, my eyes darted across the polished stainless steel desk sitting in the center of the room. Beside the glowing monitor displaying the completed federal upload, I spotted a small brushed aluminum communication console. It featured a thick red button labeled for external broadcast. Sarah had wired the bunker with a sophisticated two-way audio system that connected directly to the outdoor public address speakers mounted on the barn exterior. She had designed it to warn off trespassers without ever needing to open the reinforced door. A cold, ruthless clarity washed over my mind. Cameron was standing out there in the freezing darkness, hiding behind a wall of armed cartel executioners, believing he held all the power. He believed he was moments away from claiming an $80 million fortune and erasing his father from the face of the earth. I needed to shatter that arrogant illusion into a million jagged pieces before the door finally collapsed. I placed the heavy pistol on the concrete floor and carefully crawled over to the steel desk, keeping my body extremely low to entirely avoid the line of sight from the melting door. I reached up and pressed my finger firmly against the cold red button. The external microphones crackled to life, picking up the howling wind and the furious hiss of the cutting torch outside. "Cameron," I said, my voice echoing loudly and clearly across the desolate property through the high-powered exterior speakers. "I am not opening the door, and you are never getting a single penny of your mother's money." Outside, the deafening roar of the thermal lance suddenly paused. A heavy, uncertain silence fell over the farm, broken only by the crackle of the intercom. I heard Cameron shouting furiously at his men to keep cutting, but his voice was trembling with barely concealed panic. I pressed the red button again, injecting every ounce of my cold, absolute rage into the microphone. "You are too late, Cameron," I stated, my words cutting through the freezing night air with devastating precision. "I found Sarah's hidden server. I found the forensic ledgers detailing your entire money laundering operation. I know exactly what you and Monica have been doing with the Penthouse, and I know exactly who you are working for. The cartel is not going to save you tonight. They are going to butcher you." The microphone picked up a sharp, terrified gasp from Monica. I could perfectly imagine the blood draining entirely from her face. Cameron grabbed his megaphone, his voice completely unhinged and frantic. "You are lying, old man," he screamed, the metallic distortion unable to hide his mounting terror. "You do not know anything. You are just a confused relic trying to buy time. Open the vault before they burn you alive." I leaned closer to the console, my heart pounding a steady, fearless rhythm. "I am not lying, Cameron," I replied calmly. "And I am not trying to buy time. I am simply keeping you occupied while the federal authorities mobilize. 5 minutes ago, I activated a dead man's switch that your brilliant mother programmed into this server. Every single page of your offshore banking records, every dummy shell company, and every illegal wire transfer has already been heavily encrypted and uploaded directly to the local field office of the Drug Enforcement Administration. The Cyber Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation is currently reviewing your entire financial network. The $12 million penthouse you murdered your mother for is currently being seized by the federal government. You are completely bankrupt, Cameron. You have absolutely nothing left to offer your cartel bosses." The silence outside was absolute. The horrifying realization of his complete and total destruction was finally sinking into his treacherous mind. But I was not finished. I wanted him to feel the exact same profound, agonizing despair he had inflicted upon his own mother. "And Cameron," I continued, my voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that resonated powerfully through the outdoor speakers. "The federal authorities did not just receive your financial records. They also received the high-definition video footage from the hidden cameras your mother installed in her intensive care unit. They have crystal-clear footage of Monica injecting a lethal chemical agent into her intravenous line while you stood there and watched her die. You did not outsmart anyone. Your mother recorded her own murder to ensure you would spend the rest of your miserable life rotting in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The cartel will realize their domestic hub is gone before sunrise. You are a dead man walking, Cameron. Your only option now is to run." A sudden, furious, animalistic scream of pure, unchecked rage erupted from the megaphone outside. The thermal lance roared back to life. I crawled back to Victor, raising my heavy pistol. A massive boom shook the foundation as the locking mechanism gave way. The door is breached. Smoke fills the room. Cartel thugs pour in laser sights, cutting through the darkness. The smoke billowing from the melted titanium hinges was thick and acrid, burning my eyes. Through the swirling gray haze, a dozen crimson laser sights pierced the darkness, dancing erratically across the polished concrete floor and the black steel casings of the server racks. Victor knelt completely motionless beside me, his stolen weapon raised and perfectly leveled at the breach. His breathing was slow and measured, the terrifying calm of a man who had accepted the violent reality of our impending demise. I gripped the heavy pistol in my hands, my finger resting lightly against the trigger guard. We were vastly outnumbered and entirely outgunned. The deafening blast of their automatic rifles seemed absolutely inevitable. I braced my shoulders against the vibrating server cabinet, fully prepared to defend Sarah's legacy with my final breath. But the deadly barrage of gunfire never came. Before a single shot could be fired inside the underground bunker, the physical atmosphere around us suddenly shifted. A deep, rhythmic thumping sound began to reverberate through the reinforced concrete ceiling, growing exponentially louder with every passing microsecond. It was the unmistakable, deafening roar of multiple heavy helicopter rotors descending rapidly upon the desolate farm. Brilliant, blinding beams of pure white light suddenly sliced through the splintered gaps in the wooden barn roof high above us. The massive aerial searchlights swept aggressively across the property, flooding the dark, overgrown valley with an artificial, glaring daylight. The sudden aerial assault sent a massive shockwave of confusion directly through the ranks of the hit squad. Their crimson laser sights stopped dancing across our cover and jerked upward toward the ceiling as the tremendous noise swallowed the room. Through the crackling exterior microphones of the bunker's communication console, a booming electronically amplified voice shattered the freezing night air. "This is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You are completely surrounded. Drop your weapons immediately." The command was repeated twice, overlapping with the screaming sirens of dozens of armored federal transport vehicles tearing through the ruined front gates. I risked a quick glance over the edge of the steel desk, peering at the bank of high-definition security monitors. The tactical feeds displayed a scene of absolute, overwhelming cinematic chaos. The 4 matte black cartel vehicles that had arrogantly blocked the barn entrance were now entirely boxed in by a massive coordinated swarm of federal agents. Heavily armed SWAT teams from the Bureau and specialized tactical units from the Drug Enforcement Administration poured out of their transport trucks in perfect tactical synchronization. They moved like a tidal wave of dark blue armor, securing the perimeter with raised ballistic shields and overwhelming superior firepower. Inside the bunker, the psychological effect of the federal raid was instantaneous and absolute. The cartel enforcers instantly recognized that their clandestine domestic operation had been catastrophically compromised. They knew that engaging in a sustained firefight with federal tactical teams would end in their immediate slaughter. The lead enforcer dropped his heavy weapon onto the concrete floor with a loud clatter and raised his empty hands into the air. The rest of the breach team immediately followed his command. The terrifying threat of imminent death vanished entirely, replaced by the chaotic sounds of tactical surrender. Victor slowly lowered his pistol, giving me a firm nod of profound relief. The cavalry had arrived. I turned my full attention back to the glowing security monitors, desperate to find the 2 people responsible for this entire nightmare. The exterior cameras provided a flawless view of the muddy clearing outside the barn. The cartel guards who had been holding the perimeter were already on their knees as federal agents swiftly moved in to secure them with heavy plastic restraints. But Cameron and Monica were not among the kneeling mercenaries. I rapidly scanned the adjacent camera feeds, spotting them near the edge of the overgrown tree line. The polished, arrogant facade of the Los Angeles investment bankers was completely gone. They looked like terrified, hunted animals. As the federal tactical units swarmed the property, completely dismantling their cartel protection, Cameron and Monica realized their grand murderous scheme had collapsed into ruin. Driven by pure, unadulterated cowardice, they abandoned their armed escorts and made a desperate, frantic dash toward the dense, freezing woods at the back of the lot. I watched my son run his expensive tactical jacket flapping wildly in the rotor wash. Monica trailed slightly behind him, struggling to navigate the treacherous, uneven ground. The blinding helicopter spotlights tracked their pathetic flight effortlessly, keeping them perfectly illuminated in the center of the muddy field. Cameron glanced back over his shoulder, his face a pale mask of absolute terror, clearly realizing that the entire perimeter was heavily fortified. In his desperate, frantic panic to escape the consequences of his actions, he failed to watch his footing. His expensive polished boots slipped violently on a thick patch of wet, freezing mud. He pitched forward with brutal momentum, slamming face first into the filthy, freezing sludge. The impact was violent and undignified. He scrambled desperately in the mud, his dark jacket soaked and ruined completely, unable to gain any traction on the slippery ground. Monica did not even pause to help her fallen husband. She continued her frantic sprint toward the trees, entirely abandoning him to his fate, only to be swiftly intercepted by 3 heavily armored federal agents who tackled her roughly into the dead grass. Cameron pushed himself up onto his knees, his face completely coated in dark, freezing mud. He was weeping openly now, sobbing with the pathetic, unrestrained terror of a man who realized his life was officially over. He turned frantically toward a pair of cartel enforcers who were currently being forced onto the ground by the advancing SWAT team. "Please," Cameron begged, his voice cracking with pathetic desperation. "Please, you have to help me up. We can still make a deal. I can still get the money." The cartel enforcer, a hardened man facing decades in federal prison because of Cameron's profound incompetence, slowly turned his head. He looked down at the weeping, mud-covered investment banker with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. The enforcer knew they had been set up, and he knew exactly who was responsible for the catastrophic failure of their operation. He did not offer a hand. Instead, the cartel guard leaned forward and spat a thick glob of saliva directly into Cameron's tear-streaked face. Before my son could even register the absolute humiliating rejection of his criminal allies, the federal tactical units descended upon him with overwhelming, unforgiving force. 4 heavily armored agents hit him simultaneously. They tackled him violently back down into the freezing mud, driving their heavy knees directly into his spine. His desperate, pathetic weeping was instantly muffled as his face was shoved mercilessly into the dirt. They wrenched his arms behind his back with brutal efficiency, the sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoing clearly through the exterior microphones. As I stared at the high-definition monitor watching the federal agents drag my sobbing, humiliated son up from the mud, the icy rage in my chest finally began to thaw, leaving behind a cold, undeniable sense of permanent justice. The heavy steel bulkhead of the bunker was secured by a team of armed federal agents as Victor and I finally stepped out of the subterranean fortress. The acrid smell of melted titanium from the thermal lance still lingered in the air, but it was quickly swept away by the cool, crisp wind sweeping across the open valley. The suffocating tension that had gripped my chest for the past hour began to evaporate, replaced by the chaotic symphony of absolute justice unfolding across my property. I walked out of the barn and stepped into a scene that looked like a war zone. The entire farm was bathed in the intense, strobing glare of flashing red and blue police lights. Dozens of federal tactical vehicles formed a steel barricade around the perimeter, their engines idling with a menacing rumble. Helicopters continued to circle overhead, their massive rotor blades beating the freezing air and sweeping their powerful spotlights across the dark tree line to ensure no one escaped the net. The cartel enforcers who had arrived to butcher me just minutes ago were now lined up against the side of their matte black sport utility vehicles. They were stripped of their body armor weapons confiscated and their hands securely bound with thick plastic restraints. They looked entirely defeated, their faces pressed against the cold metal doors by the federal tactical units. I ignored them. My eyes were searching for the 2 architects of this nightmare. I found them kneeling in the center of the muddy clearing, surrounded by a tight circle of federal agents. The contrast between the polished, arrogant Los Angeles investment bankers I knew and the pathetic, broken criminals kneeling in the dirt was staggering. Monica was shivering in the freezing night air. Her expensive designer clothing was torn and soaked through with filthy mud. Her hair was matted to the side of her face and her wrists were locked tightly behind her back in steel handcuffs. She stared blankly at the ground, utterly paralyzed by the sudden, catastrophic destruction of her reality. Cameron was in a worse state. The son I had raised with every advantage, the boy who had attended the finest private schools and lived a life of privilege, was reduced to a sobbing, hyperventilating mess. His face was covered in freezing mud, and the spit of the cartel enforcer he had so foolishly trusted. He was weeping hysterically, his chest heaving with ragged sobs, as two agents held him firmly by his shoulders. He looked small, fragile, and stripped of the arrogance he had worn like a crown for his entire adult life. I walked across the ruined grass, the mud squelching beneath the soles of my work boots. Victor flanked me silently, a protective shadow watching my back. The federal agents parted, stepping aside to allow me direct access to the two prisoners. As my shadow fell over him, Cameron raised his head. His bloodshot, tear-filled eyes locked onto mine, and for a fleeting moment I saw the face of the little boy I used to carry on my shoulders. But that boy was dead, buried beneath layers of greed, betrayal, and violence. Cameron strained against the grip of the federal agents trying to move closer to my boots. "Dad." He choked out, his voice a ragged whisper that was barely audible over the helicopter engines. "Dad, please. Tell them it is a mistake. I am your son. You have to tell them this is a misunderstanding. You have to save me." The audacity of his plea hit me with the force of a blow. After plotting my murder, after orchestrating an armed siege against my life, after sacrificing his own mother for a piece of leveraged real estate, his first instinct was to beg me to shield him from the consequences of his own actions. I stood still, looking down at his weeping face with a cold detachment. The sorrow that had once defined my existence was gone, replaced by an absolute clarity. I did not see my child kneeling in the dirt. I saw a monster who had destroyed my family for his own gain. "You have no idea what is happening right now. Do you, Cameron?" I asked, my voice cutting through the noise of the raid with icy precision. "You still believe you can talk your way out of this nightmare? You still believe your wealth and your charming smile will erase the blood covering your hands?" Cameron sobbed harder, shaking his head. "Please, Dad. I did not want this. I was in debt. They forced me to do it. The cartel was going to kill Monica and me if we did not deliver the money. We were trapped. I had to secure the estate. I had no other choice." I let out a low, bitter sound that contained no humor. "There is always a choice, Cameron." I stated my words echoing in the freezing air. "You could have come to me. You could have told me the truth about your failures and your criminal debts. I would have spent every penny I owned to protect you from those people. I would have bankrupted myself to save your life. But you did not choose to seek my help. You chose to use my name to launder millions of dollars in illicit drug money. You chose to transform the beautiful luxury penthouse I built into the central hub of a violent criminal enterprise. You chose to send a heavily armed tactical unit to this farm tonight, to slip a heavy sedative into my hand so I would quietly pass away in my sleep. You did not just make a simple mistake, Cameron. You actively, maliciously conspired to wipe me off the face of the earth so you could loot your mother's hidden vault and pay off your bloody debts." Monica finally looked up, her face pale and contorted with a sudden desperate panic. "William, please listen to reason," she pleaded, her voice trembling violently. "We can surrender the penthouse. We can cooperate with the federal investigators and give them the cartel bosses. We can fix this. You have to tell them we are victims here." I shifted my gaze to Monica, feeling nothing but pure, unadulterated disgust. "You are not victims," I replied coldly, my voice loud enough for the surrounding federal agents to hear perfectly. "You are cold, calculating murderers, and you are both going to spend the rest of your miserable, pathetic lives rotting in a maximum security federal penitentiary." Cameron thrashed weakly against the federal agents holding him firmly pinned down. "Dad, no. Please," he wailed, his voice cracking with absolute terror. "I am your one and only son. You cannot let them take me away. You are my own father. You have to protect me. You have to forgive me." I took one final step forward, standing directly over him. I looked down into his terrified, weeping eyes, letting the full, devastating weight of my absolute rejection crush his final pathetic shred of hope. I slowly looked directly down at him. You stopped being my son the exact moment you put that poison in your mother's arm. The silence that followed my words was heavy, absolute, and final. Cameron stared up at me, unable to comprehend the totality of his destruction. But Monica understood. The calculating veneer she had worn for years shattered completely. She violently twisted her body away from her husband. "It was him," Monica screamed over the thumping helicopter blades. "It was entirely his idea. He forced me to do it. He told me the cartel would slaughter my entire family if I did not help him secure the estate. I had absolutely no choice. I am a victim here." Cameron snapped his head toward her, his tear-streaked face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. His own wife was now feeding him to the wolves to save her skin. They began screaming at each other, trading vicious accusations in a miserable display of cowardice. I felt a deep, profound wave of nausea wash over me. These people who had plotted to rule an empire were crumbling the moment they faced a consequence. A tall man wearing a jacket emblazoned with the letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation stepped forward. He moved with calm, methodical authority. He bypassed the screaming couple entirely and walked directly over to where Victor and I stood. He removed his tactical glove and extended a firm hand. "Mr. William," the lead agent said, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that commanded immediate respect. "My name is Special Agent Miller. I want to assure you that you are completely safe now. We received the entire data package from your automated server protocol exactly 22 minutes ago. Your wife's forensic accounting ledgers are flawless. They provided us with the exact decryption keys we needed to entirely dismantle their illicit financial network." I shook his hand, feeling the immense crushing weight of the past month finally begin to lift from my weary shoulders. Agent Miller turned his attention down to Cameron, who had stopped arguing with Monica and was now staring up at the federal agent with wide, terrified eyes. "Cameron," Agent Miller stated, his tone devoid of any sympathy or warmth, "I am formally advising you that as of 10 minutes ago, a federal judge approved an emergency seizure order under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Your luxury penthouse in downtown Los Angeles has been raided and officially seized by the United States government. Every single domestic and offshore bank account associated with your name, your dummy shell companies, and your wife has been entirely frozen and seized. You do not have a single dime to your name. You are completely bankrupt." Cameron let out a hollow, agonizing gasp, his head slumping forward into his chest as the final nail was driven into his coffin. The vast, stolen fortune he had traded his own soul to acquire had evaporated into thin air. "There is one more thing, Agent Miller," I said, reaching a steady hand into the deep pocket of my heavy jacket. I pulled out the small, innocent-looking plastic bottle of capsules that Monica had so urgently pressed into my palm earlier that afternoon. I held the bottle out, presenting it directly to the federal agent. "My daughter-in-law gave these to me just a few hours ago," I explained, ensuring my voice carried clearly over the idling engines of the armored transport vehicles. "She told me they were high-grade nutritional supplements designed to help me sleep and manage my profound grief. I strongly suspect your forensic laboratory will discover that they contain a lethal, untraceable chemical agent. They fully intended for me to drive out to this remote property, ingest this poison, and quietly pass away from a massive, completely undetectable heart attack." Monica let out a horrific, strangled wail, her eyes rolling back slightly as she realized the absolute depth of her legal peril. The federal agent took the plastic bottle from my hand, slipping it carefully into a clear, tamper-proof evidence bag. He looked down at the sobbing woman with an expression of pure, icy contempt. "Well, Monica," Agent Miller said, securing the top of the evidence bag, "it appears we will be adding the attempted premeditated murder of a federal witness to your growing list of charges, right alongside the first-degree murder of your mother-in-law and federal racketeering. You are both looking at multiple consecutive life sentences in a maximum security federal penitentiary without any possibility of parole." The lead agent gestured sharply to his tactical team. 4 heavily armored officers stepped forward, grabbing Cameron and Monica roughly by their upper arms and hauling them up from the freezing mud. They did not treat them like wealthy, sophisticated investment bankers. They treated them like the violent, treacherous criminals they truly were. I stood silently, my breathing finally steady and calm, as I watched my son and his wife being dragged across the ruined grass. They were forcefully shoved into the back of a heavily armored federal police cruiser. The heavy steel doors slammed shut with a deafening final thud, locking them away in a dark, inescapable cage of their own making. The convoy of federal vehicles slowly began to pull away their tires, churning up thick waves of mud and gravel as they navigated the long, dark driveway. The blinding searchlights from the helicopters shifted away, banking hard to the east as they escorted the prisoners back toward the city. The chaotic symphony of screaming sirens and shouting voices gradually faded into the far distance, leaving behind a profound, heavy silence over the desolate valley. The flashing red and blue lights disappeared over the horizon, plunging the property back into the quiet darkness of the rural night. I stood alone in the center of the muddy clearing, feeling the cold wind brush against my face. The overwhelming terror and adrenaline that had fueled my actions for the past several hours were slowly draining away, leaving a strange, hollow sense of tranquility in their wake. Justice had finally been served. Sarah's killers were locked away, and her legacy was secure. Victor stepped quietly out from the shadows of the splintered wooden gates, his heavy tactical boots crunching softly on the gravel. He walked over and stood beside me, his eyes scanning the empty driveway before looking back at the rusting farmhouse. He reached out and clapped a heavy, reassuring hand firmly onto my shoulder. The silent gesture spoke volumes, conveying a deep bond forged in the crucible of unimaginable violence and shared survival. We had held the line against impossible odds. "What now, Bill?" Victor asked, his gravelly voice remarkably calm and steady in the silent aftermath of the raid. I turned my head and looked slowly across the dying grass. I looked at the rotting wooden planks of the main house, the collapsing roof, and the general state of complete disrepair that masked the true nature of this location. I thought about the impenetrable high-tech subterranean fortress, buried deep beneath the mud, and the $80 million empire of bearer bonds and mineral rights sitting quietly in the dark. I took a deep breath of the cold night air. Now I build. Exactly 6 months have passed since that terrifying freezing night in the hidden underground bunker. The heavy, suffocating darkness that once defined this desolate patch of California earth has been entirely eradicated. The brutal wheels of the federal justice system moved with an uncharacteristic, merciless speed, fueled by the absolutely flawless mountain of encrypted digital evidence my beautiful wife had meticulously compiled. The massive data payload Sarah had designed to execute from beyond the grave struck the international cartel with the devastating, unstoppable force of a targeted nuclear strike. Within 48 hours of the farm raid, the federal authorities had completely dismantled the entire money laundering network. High-ranking cartel lieutenants, corrupt banking officials, and ruthless enforcers were simultaneously dragged from their luxurious beds in the dead of night, securely locked in heavy steel chains, and buried under a seemingly infinite avalanche of federal racketeering charges. Cameron and Monica did not escape the relentless, crushing weight of their own terrifying arrogance. Their high-priced, sophisticated defense attorneys abandoned them the very second the government successfully seized every single penny of their ill-gotten bloody wealth. They stood in the crowded federal courtroom, completely alone, stripped of their tailored designer suits and their polished, deceitful smiles. I sat in the front row of the gallery on the day of their final sentencing. I watched in absolute silence as the stern federal judge handed down their punishments. For the brutal, premeditated first-degree murder of my beloved wife, and for their extensive, undeniable roles in a massive international criminal syndicate, Cameron and Monica were each given consecutive life sentences in a maximum security federal penitentiary. They were denied any possibility of parole. They will never breathe free air again. They will die in those small, concrete cages. With my treacherous son permanently removed from society, I finally turned my undivided attention to the immense, staggering fortune Sarah had left behind. $80 million in untraceable bearer bonds and lucrative mineral rights sat quietly in the dark, waiting for a righteous purpose. I did not want to simply hoard the wealth. I wanted to transform it into a powerful, lasting weapon against the very same kind of cruelty that had temporarily shattered my existence. I hired the finest demolition crews in the state to completely level the rotting, decayed wooden farmhouse and the rusted, corrugated metal barn. We tore up the freezing, blood-stained mud and excavated the hidden concrete bunker, erasing the grim history of the property entirely. In its place, I built a magnificent, sprawling sanctuary. The new facility rises proudly against the backdrop of the rugged Ojai Mountains, constructed from warm natural stone and vast expanses of reinforced glass that let the healing California sunlight pour into every single corridor. This is not a dark, hidden vault. It is a state-of-the-art legal advocacy center and a permanent, highly secure residential sanctuary designed exclusively for vulnerable senior citizens who have been financially exploited, physically abused, or maliciously manipulated by their own greedy families. We employ a dedicated, relentless team of former federal prosecutors, brilliant forensic accountants, and compassionate trauma therapists. We provide absolute, impenetrable shelter and aggressive, unforgiving legal representation to those who have been tossed aside by the very people who were supposed to love and protect them the most. Victor stayed by my side through the entire construction process. The battle-hardened former Marine trades his tactical gear for tailored civilian suits, serving as the primary director of security for the entire compound. He manages a highly trained staff that ensures no predator, no abusive relative, and no desperate criminal will ever breach these walls. Our residents walk the grounds with complete peace of mind, knowing they are fiercely protected by a shield forged from absolute resolve and vast, undeniable resources. The wealth that Cameron and Monica had so desperately tried to steal to save their own pathetic lives is now being utilized to systematically dismantle the lives of other abusers. I walk slowly along the winding, beautifully paved pathways of the central courtyard. The air is warm and fragrant, filled with the sweet, comforting scent of blooming jasmine and vibrant lavender. I am 70 years old, yet I feel remarkably, undeniably reborn. The heavy, agonizing grief that had once threatened to drown me completely has been replaced by a profound, enduring sense of purpose. I stop walking and stand quietly before a massive, ancient oak tree positioned at the very heart of the sanctuary gardens. Nestled respectfully at the base of its thick, sprawling roots is a simple, elegant plaque cast in solid, polished bronze. The plaque does not list my name or detail the violent, chaotic history of the cartel raid. It bears a single beautiful inscription dedicated to the brilliant, fearless woman who foresaw the approaching darkness and built the ultimate weapon to protect me from it. It simply reads, "In loving memory of Sarah. Her light remains our shield." I reach out gently, tracing the raised metallic letters with my fingertips. I can feel the warmth of the afternoon sun radiating from the polished bronze. Sarah fought a brutal, terrifying war from the cold confines of her hospital bed, and she fought a second, even more devastating war from the grave. She anticipated every single treacherous move our son would make, and she countered his profound greed with an overwhelming, absolute manifestation of pure love. Cameron believed that my age made me weak, and he believed that his mother's illness made her defenseless. He was catastrophically, fatally wrong on both accounts. Her love had constructed an impenetrable fortress around my life, and her brilliant mind had engineered the perfect, inescapable trap for our enemies. I stand tall in the golden sunlight, taking a long, deep breath of the fresh, clean air. The nightmare is finally permanently over. I look out across the peaceful horizon, knowing that our family fortune is finally serving its true purpose. The dark secrets that once poisoned our lives have been thoroughly washed away by the relentless pursuit of absolute truth. Every single day, we provide vital hope to the hopeless and immense strength to the highly vulnerable victims. The empire of shadows has been entirely eradicated, replaced by a legacy of light, justice, and enduring protection. Greed is a venom that destroys everything it touches, but the most painful betrayal always comes from those we carry in our hearts. We spend our lives building empires for our children, hoping they inherit our work ethic, but sometimes they only inherit our wealth. Blood does not guarantee loyalty, and age does not mean weakness. When faced with ultimate betrayal, a father's toughest choice is not protecting his child, but allowing them to face the devastating consequences of their own actions. True wealth is never found in a luxury penthouse. It is found in integrity, resilience, and courageous rebuilding. If this dark story of betrayal and ultimate justice kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that subscribe button right now. Have you ever had to cut ties with a toxic family member? Share your story in the comments below. I read every single one. Thank you.